Okay, looking at the state of the world, you have to wonder, how did we get into this mess? I mean, surely there was enough evidence decades ago that we were heading in the wrong direction. After all, the wisdom of generations past was based on their lived experience, if I can say, and it was handed on so that we could learn from the mistakes of others. But every generation seems to want to make their own mistakes in an effort to reconstruct the laws of civil society. I guess it's just human nature. And mistakes, well, as long as they aren't catastrophic, they don't really matter at a personal level. I mean, we all make them and we bounce back, hopefully better and wiser for the experience. But I have to say, that doesn't seem to happen at the political level. Now, don't get me wrong. Our political leaders make plenty of mistakes. It's just they don't seem to learn from them. It's almost the opposite, actually. When they realise that they've messed up, instead of reversing course, they instead try and double down and they keep trying to get that canoe up that particular creek without a paddle. I mean, how else can you explain the circumstances we now find ourselves in? Think about the national debt for a second. It's close to $1 trillion. It's set to go much, much higher. And it wasn't that long ago when we had no net debt. And then it crept up with a promise that a surplus is just around the corner. And it didn't matter if it was Liberal or Labor, the same rubbish rhetoric was applied. And then we were told, once the debt got out of control, that it wasn't a problem. The experts said we could just print more money to pay it off. Well, that's the thing of a third-rate mind with a double-digit IQ. And yet, it was embraced across the world. Funny though, with all the money printing done so far, governments right across that world are more indebted than ever. I mean, if it was so easy, why didn't they just pay off their own loans instead of creating more with the trillions of dollars that they've printed? Nowhere has this been more apparent than in the United States. Now, over the last 52 years, the US government has run a budget surplus in just 4 of them. Those accumulated surpluses, that's a touch more than $600 billion, is almost matched by the interest due on the national debt this year alone. Imagine that. The bulk of the US national debt is now money that was borrowed to pay previous interest commitments. That is not a recipe for success. If you doubt me, just go and ask any bankrupt. It's much the same in Europe and actually right across the Western world, I have to say. And maybe some of these problems stem from our political leaders. I mean, outside of climbing the greasy pole of politics, they haven't actually got that many achievements to their name. Now let's think about the big 5. US President Joe Biden? Well, he and his family got rich from his 49 years in politics. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern? Well, she was the former president of International Socialist Youth. She worked in political offices and then she went into Parliament aged 28. And what about Canada's despot, Justin Trudeau? A secondary school teacher who chaired a charity, I'm presuming to make his CV look good, before he too entered Parliament. And our own Anthony Albanese, he was an electorate officer before beginning his 26-year parliamentary career thus far. And in the last of them, the UK, the new PM there, Liz Truss, well, at least she's had a stint in business, which maybe explains why the political socialists over there seem to hate her tax-cutting agenda so much. All in all, it's not a particularly deep talent pool in the Anglosphere. And even the dimmest of them, and their predecessors I should point out, cannot be that thick that they don't see the problems that their policies have created. Now, I've just pointed out it's a pretty bad bunch globally, but I also have to say it's not much better on the domestic front. Our current and former state leaders are mostly lacklustre business people, political apparatchiks or time-serving union hacks. Their great skill, it seems to be influencing people to advance their own careers or to help them cling to power rather than creating something credible and sustainable. So when you look at those entrusted with leadership, it's actually not that surprising that although they probably do realise there's a problem, they haven't got a clue about how to solve it. But thank goodness we have the geniuses residing in global think tanks of influence like the World Economic Forum, the United Nations and George Soros's Open Societies Foundation, so that they can do the heavy thinking for our political elites. These are some of the most influential outfits in the world. And yet, None of them promote freedom or personal autonomy. They all seek to centralise power or exert forces, and often using the democratic process that actually subverts freedom and democracy. Their answer to global issues is that they can only be solved with more money, more authority, and more compliant people, both as leaders in politics and the followers, that's you and me. Over the years, they, and groups like them, have cooked up so many schemes to usher in that compliance, ranging from the eugenicists of the early 1900s through to the Club of Rome and their limits of growth thesis of 1972, and I should point out their subsequent Mankind at the Turning Point publication of 1975. Now, those latter publications really kicked off the elite desire to constrain humankind. They posited that economies and environments were controllable by man, and thus catastrophes were preventable or avoidable. And that kick-started the thought process that led to where we are today. Government meddling and interfering in everything, promising to make it better, but invariably making it much, much worse. In 1991, the club published a new document, The First Global Revolution. Here's some quotes directly from it. The need for enemies seemed to be a common historical factor. Some states have striven to overcome domestic failure and internal contradictions by blaming external enemies. The ploy of finding a scapegoat is as old as mankind itself. When things become too difficult at home, divert attention to adventure abroad. Bring the divided nation together to face an outside enemy, either a real one or else one invented for the purpose. But therein lies the problem. See, as the First Global Revolution book went on to point out, I quote again, every state has been so used to classifying its neighbours as friend or foe that the sudden absence of traditional adversaries has left governments and public opinion with a great void to fill. New enemies have to be identified, new strategies imagined, and new weapons devised. All right, does that seem to ring a bell with you about where we are today? You pick a foe, you push the propaganda to get people united in the cause you've chosen for them, and you let history do the rest. In recent times, these have mostly been individuals that we've targeted. You think about Saddam Hussein or Colonel Gaddafi. They were the great evils that had to be constrained. However, the enemy hasn't always exclusively been a person. Again, the Club of Rome report anticipated the future when they wrote this. In searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat which must be confronted by everyone together. But in designating these dangers as the enemy, we fall into the trap which we've already warned readers about, namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All these dangers are caused by human intervention in natural processes, and it is only through changed attitudes and behaviour they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. Let me read that again. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. Welcome to the war on global warming. Climate change. Welcome to the war on humanity. This is just another means of uniting and controlling the people against a common enemy. No sacrifice is too great for you to make in order to save your fellow citizens. Sure, we may go backwards economically, but we were told way back in the 1970s there was a limit to growth and prosperity. Now, unfortunately, the wheels seemed to come off the global warming wagon when the doomsday predictions repeatedly failed. I mean, you can only be given 5 years to live so many times over the decades before people start to see a crank. That probably explains why you don't get to see this bloke so much anymore.
Now we've got a whole new category of global or strategic problems, which include the hole in the ozone layer, which now could appear above the United States, global climate change, the destruction of the rainforest at a rate that means they'll be totally gone in another few decades unless we stop, the pollution of the oceans and the atmosphere, and the like.
Right, that was Al Gore. He was the early pioneer of the renewable energy movement, the global warming thing, and now he was They're lamenting the loss of the rainforest. Well, who would have thought the key to saving the rainforests was actually using wood as an energy source? Yeah, that's right. It is officially the highest renewable contributor to global energy usage. That sums up the stupidity of the left. Anyway, when that boondoggle busted under the weight of bull dust, we were suddenly hit with a new enemy, this time in the form of a virus that closed the world. You see, then it was very easy to blame the woes of the world on the steps we were forced to take to save mankind from this virus. Only now, the evidence suggests the steps we took weren't based on science, but on whim. And when the gloss of that wore off, well, we needed a new global enemy, didn't we? I mean, thank goodness. As if on cue, Vladimir Putin emerged from his bunker to be blamed for inflation, energy price hikes, and basically every other sort of catastrophe afflicting the world. I keep saying on this show that when it comes to what you are told by authorities, you should trust nothing and verify everything. Never has that been more important than it is now.